home, and
Yeah.
nor would I ever want to be. That's between
No,
them.
exactly.
All right, I hate to cut you guys off. This is great. But we're gonna go ahead and get started. We've got some people still logging in. And you know, we just want to say good afternoon and welcome everyone to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Julia Alvarez in conversation with Barbara Lane. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I will also be your host for the afternoon. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. We're thrilled to be offering free online events during these times to keep our community connected while we're forced to be separated. As COVID-19 continues to endanger the future of independent bookstores like us, you can show your support for Copperfields and help keep us alive by purchasing a book through our online store. We thank you for your continued support. So a couple of house cleaning items before I introduce today's author. One is we will be utilizing the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfield's events, links for purchasing Julia's latest book, as well as her previous titles, and also my contact details for post-event questions and information. Additionally, Q&A box will be your go-to with any questions or comments for the author. The format for today's event will feature 30 to 45 minutes of in-conversation speaking and will be followed by a live Q&A. We will try to get to as many of your questions as we can, as your feedback is welcomed and appreciated. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see an icon that says Q&A. Please submit your questions here rather than replying to my posts in the chat box, as this will be much more convenient for the Q&A portion. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speakers. We are thrilled to be welcoming Julia Alvarez. Julia left the Dominican Republic for the United States in 1960 at the age of 10. She is the author of 6 novels, 3 books of nonfiction, 3 collections of poetry, and 11 books for children and young adults. She has taught and mentored writers in schools and communities across America, and until her retirement in 2016, was a writer in residence at Middlebury College. Her work has garnered wide recognition, including a Latina Leader Award in Literature from the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, the Hispanic Heritage Award in Literature, the Woman of the Year by Latina Magazine, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award, and inclusion in the New York Public Library's program, The Hand of the Poet, Original Manuscripts by 100 Masters from John Donne to Julia Alvarez. Her novel, In the Time of the Butterflies, has over 1 million copies in print and was selected by the National Endowment for the Arts for its National Big Read program. In 2013, President Obama awarded Alvarez the National Medal of Arts in recognition for her extraordinary storytelling. And in conversation with Julia this afternoon is our very own Barbara Lane. Barbara is the Director of Events for Copperfield's Books, and she also writes an amazing column on books for the San Francisco Chronicle. And with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Barbara.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being here. We're delighted that you're part of our Copperfield's community. And as Jamie said, we are so thrilled to have Julia Alvarez. I have been a fan for a really long time, starting with How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. I remember that book vividly. And I'm so thrilled for the new book, Afterlife, because I am one of 4 sisters. I have 3 sisters. We are 4 total girls in our family. And anybody who has a sister is going to love this new book. But also, this book is about a certain point in life, and Julie and I are very close in age, so I know a little bit about that as well. So I'm going to try to restrain myself so I don't go over our allotted time and leave time for your questions. But welcome, Julia, and let's just jump right in and acknowledge that this is your first novel for adults in 15 years. Welcome back.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to Copperfield's, Barbara, Jamie. I want to say I've been before at your store in Petaluma. I loved it. And I apologize for any technical difficulties. I am in Vermont. We're having a big storm here. I live on a country road where the internet is very iffy. So anything that goes awry, we're all on a learning curve with this pandemic. But also want to thank, it's a little strange to be with you and not with you. You know, this idea that I'm in Petaluma, but I'm not in Petaluma. And I get very disoriented by that. But I tell myself that, you know, as a reader, I know this place. Reading is always about being together apart. So in some ways, I should have the skill set to be able to do this. And I also want to acknowledge that it's wonderful what independent bookstores are doing, how they've stepped up to the plate during the pandemic and are providing us with this free content. But of course, things aren't ever free. And the way I think about it is, I think, you know, bookstores, independent bookstores have been taking care of us readers and authors forever. And now it's a time to support them. So I tell people on events, please, just, you know, independent bookstores are like species that are going extinct, organizations and community vibrant centers that we want them to be there and we have to support them. So I, you know, I am sometimes not the best at ordering locally, but I've been, any gift or birthday that I can send from our local little Vermont bookshop, that's where I go. And it's been wonderful to support the community has put, because we wanted to survive the pandemic. So with that said, I'm ready for questions.
Good, thank you, Julia. And copperfieldsbooks.com, for those of you who don't know how to order from us, we appreciate that. And we are all about community, and thank you for that endorsement. So the subject of your new book, Afterlife, is about a woman going through, quote, the quote, disorienting transition of old age, end quote. Why did you want to write about this period of life? Tell us why this was important to you.
Well, you alluded to at the beginning too, that it's my first adult novel in 15 years. And it isn't that it took me 15 years to write, or that I wasn't writing, I was taking it easy. For me, writing is a practice, something that I have to do to integrate things every day. So I was writing all along, but I felt like I didn't want to go back and repeat the old things that I already knew. And I was entering a new period of life. And I talk about this novel as my first one as an elder. It's, and I needed to integrate things myself in order to understand all these things that were coming together to be able to write about it. So I think that part of the thing I was also missing, you know, when I started writing about Latinx families and about sisters, is because those books weren't there for me. You know, I grew up, I was talking to Gish Jen at an event, and we were laughing because we both grew up in a pre-multicultural world. Those books were not there. They were not a given. So I sort of wrote the books on the bookshelf that I was missing. And I've been missing books about older characters and about aging, about women and growing older, not just as background figures, but what is this new stage of life? What are the identity issues here? What are the challenges? And also, frankly, not that many novels about Latinas, older Latinas, except they're abuelitas or they're airbrushed into these wise women. And I didn't feel like aging had made me any wiser. So I just wanted, I didn't have answers. I wanted a novel where I could follow the questions.
Well, I, for one, so fully appreciate that you've done this, because I have read any number of novels, seen any number of movies where somebody over 50 is 1 foot in the grave. And it's so refreshing to have your character, and she's vibrant and she's full of life, but she's clearly at a point where she has some reflection, where she has an opportunity to look back. And your protagonist, who's a recently retired professor like yourself, is newly widowed. Her husband dies of an aneurysm very quickly and very unexpectedly. Your husband, however, is very much alive. Did
Yeah.
you have to imagine him dead to write this book?
It's so funny because one of the things I worried about, having sisters, this, there's going to be some problem with your novel. I mean, one of the characters will remind them of themselves, and they'll, say, well, I would never wear that outfit that you described, or whatever. And he said, don't worry, he's great about being married to a fiction writer. He knows how that all works. And he said, well, if anybody gives you a hard time, say, what do they have to complain about? I get killed in the first page. So I think it just, I was thinking very much about loss. I have many friends that have lost partners. As a Latina, I come from a huge extended family. My father was the youngest of 25 kids. First wife had 10, and then she died, and amazingly, not in childbirth. And then he married a second younger woman and had 15. My father was the youngest. So I come from a clan. Growing up in the Dominican Republic, there were all these wonderful people around me, storytellers. But what happens, it's great. What happens is that when that time comes that you start losing your elders, you don't just lose one or two, you lose a whole phalanx of people. You lose dozens of tios and tias, madrinas, padrinos, abuelos, older primos and primas. You lose so many. Just feels like, like a devastation has come through. So I think that, where was I going with this, Barbara?
Well, you were talking about, the question was about imagining your husband dead, and
Loss.
Loss.
There was a time of loss. I lost my parents within 4 months of each other after losing them for 10 years to Alzheimer's. I mean, that is endless every day, accreting the losses. Huge family. I lost my older sister. It just felt like I was surrounded by personal loss. And then when I looked up for respite, I was surrounded by a world where I call it living in elegiac times, where we're seeing the, climate change bringing about extinct species, terrible storms, little coastline places going underwater, and then the divisiveness, the civil, a civil society breaking apart, violence, in the schools, violence against community of colors, draconian immigration laws. It just felt like, whoa, so many losses. And it's sort of like Afterlife is trying to figure out, how do we live in a broken world and not lose ourselves hope in creating a more beloved community, if not only for ourselves, for the young people coming after us who need our support and vibrancy. And boy, are they stepping up to the plate in every way possible. And so, it was a time of loss. And I felt like, as I said, writing for me is a way to not answer the questions, but understand them.
Well, your response brought up so many things. I have to collect myself for a minute because I'm still reeling from the 25 children that your father had. And just as an aside, because I want to get back to this book because there's so much in it, you had to leave the Dominican Republic when you were 10 because your father was involved in a plot to overthrow Trujillo, who was a dictator of a certain stripe. So I just want to acknowledge that, because it seems to me that your response to so much of what is happening in our country today and immigration policy and so forth so forth was shaped by that very fundamental experience you had in your childhood. But I can't go there right now because I want to talk about this book. So let's talk about the immigration issue before we even get to the sisters. Your character, Antonia Vega, sort of reluctantly becomes, or inadvertently becomes involved in the immigration issue because somebody who's working on the neighboring farm in Vermont enlists her to help bring his fiance to Vermont. And what I love about this book is she doesn't jump in and become his savior. She has sort of a mixed mind about getting involved this way. So I'd love to know about sort of how you approached that story, because it's very complex.
That's exactly it, Barbara. Activism is complex, and we come at our actions with all kinds of mixed reasons. And part of it is that, I wanted a character that was allowed the same diversity that we ask in communities within herself. She calls herself a reluctant activist. She doesn't go there naturally. And people always assume because she's Latina that she should, So part of the book is about how we fix people in these identities, which is a way not to give them individually the full diversity that we want. Ironically, in the book, her husband, a white guy, from the heartland of America, whom everyone assumes she has radicalized because he married this Latina. So she's getting him into all these causes that he's in. He's really the political one, much more than she is. And it's an interesting dynamic because, when she loses him and all of a sudden she's confronted with what is she going to do in this situation she's Latina, so she feels an obligation and a responsibility to help these undocumented workers in a farm in Vermont to navigate the system. So she does feel the obligation, but what we do is that because we're in her point of view, we get to feel the complexity of the choices that she makes. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really freeing to people to realize that activism doesn't look just one way, and that it isn't, someone who's a real activist, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Those people are scary to me. I think people that allow complexity in themselves are going to allow it in someone else. And that's part also of the book. How we put people in these othering chutes is the way Antonia thinks of it. He's the sheriff. He's this big white guy with a gun. He is this way. Yes. Oh, he's a farmer and he's kind of rough with these undocumented workers. And she keeps getting surprised. Yes. And having to open up her judgments. And so the diversity in self is also important, yes. To allow who we are. Otherwise we're being oppressors of ourselves, and yep.
I love that. None of it is black and white. It's all nuanced. And your protagonist, Antonia, it lives a very privileged life. She's been a university professor. She has this place in Vermont. She's comfortable. So her life is actually quite different from that of the undocumented person who she's enlisted to help. And he is not an angel, nor is his fiance. They have their own complexities. So all of that, really, I'm gratified by it because it makes it more real and more textured. The other thing about this whole issue is, you and you might not want to talk about this because it was blown so crazy, but you blurbed American Dirt when it first came out, which, as many of us know, in fact, the author was scheduled to come speak at Copperfield, and we had to cancel it amidst the huge uproar and backlash about that book. But you were somebody who was an early supporter and blurber of the book, and then so many people challenged the author's right to tell the immigration story. So do you just want to say a few words about that whole experience and where it's shaken
Well,
for you?
I was, yeah, it's another very complex and nuanced story, and it gets put out there, and it becomes, you know, oh, she supported, he didn't, she did, da da da. And the other thing that's ironic, you know, we're talking about diversity and a multiplicity of voices. And when I first set out, you know, with Afterlife, nobody wanted to talk about Afterlife. They wanted to talk about American Dirt. So yeah, it's, and you know, I don't want to avoid it, but the complication, when I got the book, and I'm not going to renege on my reading the book and getting absorbed with it. And I
Right.
can talk a little bit about that, because for me, it was the first time that I was in a fictional work in which I was going through, you know, being a refugee and seeking asylum inside a woman's body. It was very much about being a mother, trying to save her son. It was, this is the way I read it. Number two, people that are of, you know, Mexican descent can see inaccuracies that they feel were upsetting to them. You know, we're not all the same. Dominican culture is really different. I wouldn't have picked up those things. So for me, I didn't know that there were misrepresentations. You know, the other thing is that when I read the novel, I didn't know anything about this writer. And the cover letter that was sent to me said two things: that she had Puerto Rican descent, and that she was married to a person that had been undocumented. So where does my mind go? You know, immediately that one certain, only a certain kind of undocumented. So I wasn't even reading with my radar up, you know. When everything blew up, I understood where it came from, because I, as I said, came of literary age in a pre-multicultural world. And so I know, I mean, Garcia Girls was published when I was 41, and I've been writing already for 25 years, and everything was getting rejected. So I know the wounds and the anger, and we're seeing it now in communities of color, of things not being acknowledged, and not enough representation, and not enough diversity of authors. And it just, the optics of it, that suddenly person that didn't really identify as Latina, whose husband was a Mexican refugee seeking asylum, suddenly gets championed as the great American novel. And I think that's the error more of the publisher and
Yes.
how they presented it than anything else. But the reason I didn't join in is that it seemed to me that the tone and the fury and the divisiveness in how the conversation was being framed was something that maybe this is part of being an elder, it's not something I wanted to participate in it. I didn't want to be in that paradigm. And later I heard Ruby Sales, the civil rights activist, talk about when she enters a place where, you know, there are white supremacists and there are Black activists, and it is just, people are just so furious at each other. And she says the first question she asks is, where does it hurt? Because that's really what we need to address. And that's the question that I couldn't see a way to ask when it was all blown up. Okay, where does it hurt? what are we really grieving and addressing here, and what can we do to change that? And we don't need more either ors or divisiveness. And within the Latino community, we don't need that either. Who is for, who is against? How can we address this? And I'm on a learning curve with everyone else. And I know when I read a novel that's set in the Dominican Republic, even by friends of mine whose writing I admire, I read it and I say, boy, did they get that wrong. Oh, that a Dominican would never say that, And so we're protective and tender towards our cultural representations. And so I understood the whole complexity of it. But how do you have I've already taken up 10 minutes on this. How do you have a conversation like this where everybody's yelling and upset? Rightly so, rightly so. So it's complicated.
Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you for addressing it this way. And thank you for that. Where does it hurt? That's really sort of revelatory to me. And I appreciate that. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation.
I mean, are we saying that, about the current president? In one of my characters is always using air quotes. So in Izzy's air quotes, that it's a time to say, not to send out a militarized force to tamp it down, but to, where does it hurt? My nation, where does it hurt? And we need, other people to step in and young people to step in who are asking that. And what can we do to address that? Together, we need all hands on board,
I thank you for that. I'm going to turn back to the novel and talk about the sisters. So again, I believe you were one of four. You've written about four sisters in the Garcia Girls, in The Time of the Butterflies. And as I said at the outset, anybody with sisters is going to love this book because that's a very special relationship. You can't describe it to anybody who doesn't have sisters. And your ear for the conversations, the irreverence, and the humor, which is often unintentional. There's one sister who constantly mangles expressions. The sisters don't hesitate to swear at each other graphically and say, I hope this isn't deleted out, fuck you to each other upon occasion. So can you talk about the importance of you having sisters and writing about this relationship and what's special to you about it?
Well, one of the things too with Afterlife is that I was interested, as you pointed out, I've always been interested in sisters. I'm from a family of 4 sisters too. And, the kinds of, what happens when you get a group of women together that are really with a powerful bond, but not without all the complications ensuing, So I've always loved that. For me, when we came to this country, there weren't that many people like us around. It was before the big Dominican, no one could get out of the dictatorship. We escaped with help, but people couldn't get out. And so for me, my sisters were my community. We were putting things together, and because we had this hybridity in us, these were people that could, help us. And we each found different balances. So I've always been interested in sisters. And in Afterlife, part of what I'm interested in is sisters as they're aging, older sisters. How does it play out, to have had this relationship for a lifetime, and it's not, as you point out, without its sparks. So yeah, and I think of sisterhood not just blood sisters, but often all the novels I've written involve women protagonists, and in some cases women that are juxtaposed to other women. In the name of Salome and her daughter Camilla, saving the world, a historical figure, Doña Isabel, who was the one that let the smallpox expedition around the world in 1804. And then we have a contemporary character who reads about her. So that relationship, you know, and transmission that happens between women is really important to me.
It's so interesting. I heard an interview, somebody who wrote a nonfiction book about sisters recently, and he said a sibling is the longest relationship that you'll ever have, assuming no one dies, because you lose your parents and your
Yeah.
spouse you meet when you're in your 20s or 30s or whatever. And your sister is usually almost your whole life. What about birth order, Julie? What do you think? Because I've given this a lot of thought as a sister, and you probably have too. And in your novel, the oldest, youngest dynamic and who pairs up with whom when you have four is really interesting. Where are you in the birth order, and how much do you think that matters?
You know, I have read and have heard, you know, how birth order is so effective. And I mean, it has so much to do with the kinds of people that we become. But I think that too shifts as we get older, because I'm a middle child. I have a buddy sister, but so I felt, you know, I know the oldest primogeniture. I mean, first of all, she wasn't a male oldest, and in a, you know, Latino patriarchal culture, that was considered something to apologize to my father for.
Yeah.
But he was
Yeah.
the oldest, and the baby was the baby. But I felt like it released me to be in the middle, you know, because I didn't have to be, you know, the good example or the oldest or you know, I could just, in a sense, you know, find my own way. So I don't know if that's true, but as I've gotten older, I've felt like I've had to take on sometimes the role of the responsible one, which I don't feel comfortable with. You know, of taking charge of helping set up the management of my parents, of, you know, and all of that stuff. So it's been a shifting thing, but I do think, yeah, as you allude to in Afterlife, what's really interesting is that that, you know, the relationships of the sisters kind of fixes them, and that's part of another kind of putting people in these, you know, little boxes of, oh, he's this, so he's that kind of person. Or the sister saying, well, you're the giver. Well, you're the selfish one. Well, you're the spoiled one. And, you know, we get these epithets, and we're actually much more diverse. And it comes out in the fact that they give each other ringtones on the phone that are supposed to be sound appropriate to their role in the family, you know? So I think that's one way that I detail that, you know, as a writer, you don't say these things intellectually. It has to be through story. Yes. And through detail and dialogue and plot. And that's how you think. You know, you have these questions that you are pondering, but you have to ponder them through character and events. And you have to make that interesting. And it's a way
to
embody the questions. So yeah, it goes into play all the time. You know, their role and having to play by those rules of the role that they've been assigned in the family.
And they all have very distinct personalities. One of the sisters, without giving too much away, struggles from mental illness. So this is another subject in the book that's difficult and complicated and slippery, because when does it become something where the other sisters really need to step in, and when is it just, oh, she's kooky and she's always been this way? And I imagine that was something that you had to do a lot of thinking to write about.
Well, and not only that, Barbara, one of the things is that one of the complications is when you're bicultural, and the things that would have, I remember Maxine Hong Kingston talking about this, the things that would look like, wow, that's a pathology, wow, that person is schizophrenic, are actually ways of addressing reality in another culture that worked in that culture or in that community. And then it gets thrown into a mainstream culture that pathologizes it. So part of it is Antonia's confusion about her sister. You know, is this illness, or is this, you know, a way that we've pathologized a certain way of being that doesn't work, because Izzy, the bipolar sister, is splendidly noble-hearted and big-hearted and so forth. And it just screws up her life. She's always, you know, hasn't two coins to rub together. So that's the thing, you know, and yet there's something grand about that, you know, and so it's confusing, because in another culture, you know, a more tribal culture, a culture like the culture that I came from, those kinds of impulses, and this is not to minimize true mental illness, because again, we have to be nuanced about it, but that's part of what confuses Antonia. Mm-hmm. You know, is it really pathology? Because in this first world culture where it says, always, always put on your oxygen mask first, take care of me, the way that her sister just gives everything away is not okay. You know, it doesn't work here. Right. So it's confusing, yeah.
And you explore these issues. What do we owe those in our family, and what do we owe larger society? And it's interesting because Antonia sort of struggles with how much to be involved and how much to give up of herself in order to step in and be an active participant, both in her sister's lives and in the lives of the undocumented people she's helping. And those aren't simple questions.
No, you know, I think part of the thing that I wanted with this character is, and part of the thing that everything we've talked about, it comes up of being, of allowing for complication and being nuanced, which means forgiving to others and to yourself for having that complication. And I think the best that we can do in any situation is to acknowledge all these different poles and it's a way of being present and meet the issue. And it's more painful and more work, but address it honestly by letting all these parts of ourselves, you know, meet up with what's being asked of us, and finding each time is going to be a different balance, finding the right balance. Because, you know, I was just, what was it? A wonderful quote, because, you know, we've been talking a lot about activism, you know, on the news and you know, recent years, since the 2016 debacle of an election, you know, how to be an activist. And another civil rights guru of mine, Howard Thurman, was asked this, and he says, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and go out and do it, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Mm. And I thought the truest activism is to bring what we love into the bigger circle. You know, if we're doing what we love, and we're doing it, the added thing is we're doing it with the idea of in service to our community, not just doing it, you know, self-enclosed and narcissistically. We're doing what we love, and we're doing it with a sense of service. We are adding love and our passion, and that's a sustainable circle, you know. If we're just trying to be good and, you know, rigid with that's the right thing to do, we're going to burn out, and we're going to be adding resentfulness and shrillness. And the world doesn't need that, you know? So I think it's, yeah.
So I have a million other questions. I'm going to ask you one more and then turn to some questions from our audience. We haven't addressed the Buddhism in the book, and there's so much in there. It's so rich. The final chapter of the book is called kintsugi. I hope I said that right. Which
Well,
is
it's Japanese repair technique, but
yeah.
it's about kintsugi. Yeah.
So could you talk about that and the metaphor that that is in your book? Because I found that fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you know, I often think of my novels as having a soundtrack. Like there's a song that really I listened to and recurred as I was writing. And the song in for Afterlife is the Leonard Cohen song that has the line, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And I love this Japanese repair technique whereby if something is broken, you don't try to repair it by making it look not broken, you know, by disguising where the fracture happened. In actual fact, you put a lacquer on it that's golden and gleaming so that it shows where it's been broken, but it's now whole. And to me, that is a huge metaphor for life, you know, and for older life. Antonia is, from the very first chapter, the prologue that I would have read, the broken English, it's addressed from the very first chapter, everything she has had figured out and everything that's working is shattered. You know, the way it happens in life, suddenly something happens. And the novel is really an attempt to put all the pieces together and repair what has been broken. And I really am an admirer of so many Japanese aesthetics. In fact, one of the things that I wanted to do with this novel is I've always wanted to write a short, compact, lyrical novel based on that Japanese sensibility, which we see it operating in the haiku, whereby you take away all that is unnecessary so that what remains is charged. And so that too imbues the kind of aesthetic in the book. And of course, the kintsugi that you talked about is very much, I guess, the operating system of the novel. You know, how do we live in a broken world and not lose hope in ourselves or each other and in community? And not lose hope is the repairing. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Stacy. She says, your writing is so beautiful and I love reading your stories. Writing for me is often very cathartic. I'm wondering if writing about Trujillo helped to process your father and your family's experience about having to flee the Dominican Republic.
You mean help them or helped me?
Helped you. Helped you by writing about it, you were able to process it and it was some kind of catharsis.
Oh, absolutely. It's not, it's the gasoline that runs the tank. You know, I always told my students when I was teaching that you should write about, you know, the place, the things in you that you haven't figured out, that are troubling to you, that are, you know, you should go there, not avoid it. You should go there because there's energy there, there's fuel there, and it gets in the writing. And so I think that much of what I write, once I am writing and I'm going to publish, that is the fuel, but I have to make it a novel whereby it's not just therapy, whereby other people can access the situation, the characters, and they can have the catharsis too. But I definitely think that's why I said 15 years to write this novel, not really, but I needed to process and integrate what it meant to now be an older writer, an elder storyteller, which is different from when I was younger. So I definitely feel that writing, you know, is very much a way to understand the questions and the wounds, and make meaning of them. And I think that once you make meaning, even a painful experience, it becomes bearable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Joan. We are reading In the Time of the Butterflies in our Spanish book club. We noticed that you had 2 different editions with 2 different translators. Were you unhappy with the first translation? Since we read novels in both languages, English and Spanish, side by side, we have noticed that sometimes translators make quite a few mistakes and that there doesn't seem to be much accountability. This is a big question, so have at it.
Yeah, well, it is a big question, and I'm just thinking about it because the Spanish version of Afterlife is coming out in September with Vintage Espanol, and I was sent the translation, and early on, I didn't know even what to ask for, that what could ask for things. So I was just told the translator is going to be, and at one point with the Garcia girls, the translation was done by a Spaniard, Peninsular Spanish. And it was called de Como las Chicas Garcias Perdieron su Acento. And the joke in the DR is that the Garcia girls lost their accents twice. They were speaking like Spaniards, and we don't talk like that, Dominicans, but I didn't even know to ask for that. And now what happened with In the Time of the Butterflies is that it was an Argentinian translator, and I came to this country when I was 10, with pre-bilingual education, all the multicultural stuff, and we were enforced to be monolingual in the schools, and so my dominance became in English, and I have oral Spanish from being with my familia, my parents, my sisters, but really the language that I learned to dominar, I hate that word, but to master or try to master is English. So I can read the Spanish and tell you that it doesn't sound right, but I can't tell you how to fix it. I'm not truly bilingual. So this is what happened with Más Allá. That's the name that the title for Afterlife, Más Allá. Mm-hmm. And I could read it and I could say, no, but this time it's later in my writing career, and I can make some insistences with the publishers. And I said, we need a second pair of Dominican eyes. Mm. So I have a friend, Dominican. She's an editor. She runs the Dominican Book Fair. She's very good. And she reads Mercedes Gould, is a great translator. She's Colombiana. She lives in Mexico. But like I said earlier, we who are part of the culture catch the little things. And so with Más Allá, I had issues with it, and I went back. Mercedes throughout used the word chica for girl. Mm-hmm. We don't say chica. See, this is the little nuances. We say muchacha or we say jovencita. If you say chica, it's like you're trying to be snobby and sound fancy. So, and because it's going back into Spanish and they're Dominican characters, they have to sound Dominican. Correct. With the case of Antonia. But this one was complicated because there's Mario and Estela who are Mexican. And in that, Mercedes is perfect. She's living in Mexico and she has an ear for that, hearing it all the time. So in Spanish, you had to get all these Spanishes.
Right.
And, now talking about American dirt and the lack of nuance and sensibility and sensitivity, in publishers is that when I started out and they sold the Spanish rights, I'd say, but we have to get somebody that understands Dominican Spanish. And they said, no, we want a universal Spanish that everyone will understand. And I go, what the hell is that? Is there like a universal English, a generic English? part of why we read is we want to hear Mark Twain's English, or we want to hear Toni Morrison's English, or, you know, we want to hear that texture, but they weren't doing it with foreign language translations. And was that Stacy that asked, or Joan?
Yeah, Joan.
Joan, you're very right about that. You know, no accountability, no accountability. And I shouldn't be accountable because I'm not the expert, you know, in that language. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm so glad that I have Ruth Herrera along to, I call her my Dominican eyes, you know, to say, nope, that doesn't, you know, that doesn't really go.
So were there two different translations of In the Time
Oh,
of the
yeah. With Mercedes, the Butterfly was redone by Mercedes School, and she's Colombiana, so she has an ear for Caribbean, you know, Spanish, and Ruth vetted it. So this latest translation should be much more accurate than the earlier one by Rolando Picasso. I can't remember his full name, but it was just, my auntie read it, that mi tia read it in the DR, and she said, she just howling. She was so upset with it, you know. You know, she wanted, her Spanish edition was full of things crossed out and words put in.
Well, you know, you actually address this issue in the book, because there's a point at which Antonia addresses the young Mexican pregnant girl, I believe, and says, "When are you due?" But she says it in Dominican Spanish, and it's a totally different expression in Mexican Spanish. So you address that head on.
Well, it's also a class thing, because a part of the thing that I wanted to deal with the Afterlife, again, the broad brush, is, you know, being aware of, even within a demographic, you don't all have the same opportunities. And, you know, there are nuances of privilege that have to be addressed within our community, because sometimes we feel so protective as a marginal group that we feel like we can't really go there. We need, you know, we need to all be sort of together on this. But there are the nuances. And part of the thing is that Antonia, who loves words and has been teaching literature all her working life, suddenly has to address some of the complexities, because not only is the term she uses very much from her Dominican experience, but it's slightly upper class. And it's luz, which is a beautiful expression. When a woman gives birth, it says she gave to the light. But the reason that that expression exists is that parturition and women laboring among upper class women was not considered okay to address. So the Virgin Mary brought light into the world. So the euphemism for giving birth, instead of parir o aliviarse, was dar a luz, which Antonia always is saying, Spanish is so beautiful. We have these beautiful ways of saying things. And she's forced, when she asks this young girl, who looks back at her blankly with that expression, that, hey, there's, so even the language we use and that we love is riddled with class and, you know, who gets to tell the story, who gets to choose the words. And it's a humbling experience as a writer. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I've been saying Antonia like Willa Cather. It's Antonia, so excuse
I
me.
know. But I
thank you for not correcting me.
I read the book over by Antonia because Gish Jen said, "Oh, it's so nice that you named her after my Antonia." And I said, "No, I have like 7 cousins called Antonia." But it was, yeah.
Last question. You have talked a lot about being Dominican and Dominican translation. So, and I know that the other writer who always comes to mind, at least for people I know when they talk about writers from the DR is Junot Diaz. But are there other writers from the Dominican that you can share that you love with our Copperfield's audience? Because
Oh,
I want more Dominican culture.
well, yes, there, Juno Diaz, of course, but there are such wonderful young Dominican writers. It's so wonderful. You know, when I first came out, it was like, you're the only one. And so this burden of representation, you know, I'm not the only one, you know. There's, of course, we mentioned Juno Diaz, Elizabeth Acevedo, The Poet X. That's a YA novel that has crossed over because she won a National Book Award with it. And it is
Acevedo.
Elizabeth Acevedo. Her second novel, With the Fire on High, and she just came out with a new one, which is Go Buy It, Clap When You Land, and it's about two sisters.
Oh,
and it is, she's such a wonderful writer. I can't say enough wonderful things about her. Angie Cruz, who's, you know, been writing wonderful, wonderful novels, but her breakthrough now is Dominicana, and it's getting rave reviews. She is a wonderful novelist. I can't say enough good things about her.
Say her last name again. Sorry, say her last name again.
Cruz.
Cruz.
Cruz, like Cross Cruz. Wonderful novel. I really love an older writer who worked as a public school teacher in the New York City schools all her life, retired, and she'd always been writing. And she's, you know, published over 6-7 books of poetry. Rina Espaillat. And she has been in the White House. She's been at the National Book Fair as an older writer. And I think that's very inspiring too. You know, when you have, you know, it's again, diversity and age too. And these, to find and get, you know, and get to be exercising what she loves later in life. So that's just 4 people, but, you know, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think of any number of other wonderful Dominican authors out there, and the young ones coming up, really talented. And of course, from our neighbor island, I mean, our neighbor on the island, Haitian American Edwidge Danticat. She's a wonderful writer. Anything, her new collection of stories, Everywhere Inside, I think it's called. It's a wonderful, wonderful. She's just, to me, she's like a Caribbean Chekhov. I mean, she's just very subtle, and she gets such complexity and diversity in her characters, and just such generosity and compassion in the writing. So you know, another book to buy from your independent bookstores. And I have a list, a long list, but, you know, so many books that I am just so excited about that have come out recently. A Paragon, another book.
Oh, A Paragon. Cole McCann.
Wow.
Well, I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have been able to have this conversation with you, and how lucky we all are. As I said, I've admired your work for so long, and this new novel is so special on so many different levels. Thank you so much for being so generous to us with your time, and thank you too for acknowledging the importance of independent bookstores. And I hope everybody listening will go to copperfieldsbooks.com and buy your book. And thank you for taking time from stormy Vermont 3 hours later.
I hear your rescue dog saying goodbye to us.
You know what? Somebody just dropped off a package and he is beside himself, but I'm trying to be professional in my home office. So thank you, Julia Alvarez.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and stay safe and stay hopeful, and see you on the streets when we can get out there in March. Those of us that are a little bit having to be in quarantine, but thank you. Thank you, Barbara Copperfields, and Jamie, thank you. Adios. Buenas noches.
Have a good
Goodbye.
evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.